Here we are returning to our sermon series, which we're calling The Way. As we try to continue to focus on the 7 disciplines that exemplified life in the early church and also that we believe apply to us here at Queensway Baptist Church. Now, it has been a while since we've been on this particular road. The last time we preached from this series was back on November the 28th, 2021, when Ryan spoke to us about kingdom prayer. We stopped there and we moved into our Advent series and then Christmas services, intending to pick up again on January the 2nd with part 2 of our series. A discussion of how these 7 disciplines relate to life in our homes and close circles of influence outside of our immediate family community. Part 1, the way as subjects, dealt with the 7 disciplines as they relate to that immediate community which is recognized as Christ's church, specifically us at Queensway Baptist Church, and where we consider him to be host. This is his church, where he is present to us in a very special way. Well, then along came Omicron with another round of restrictions and a decision to suspend in-person gatherings. Because we felt our Wednesday discernment gatherings were inextricably linked to this sermon series that I'm talking about, and best experienced in person, we decided to insert a short series on the Book of Habakkuk. And we've now finished that. We continued on our Wednesday night discernment online on a Zoom platform, but instead of dealing strictly with the previous sermon topic, we spent time delving deeper into some of the areas that we had already covered in part 1 of our series. And that was indeed a fruitful experience. It was rich, it was rewarding, it was truly wonderful. But it was on Zoom. God did bless that activity, and now he's made it possible to again worship together in person on Sunday as well as on Wednesday nights. And we are finally ready to move forward into part 2 of this series and ready to move forward on Wednesday nights to discerning the topic that I bring to you today. Now, it has always been our contention that we have a two-pronged approach. Sunday sermon linked to Wednesday discernment throughout all of this 3-part preaching series. But because it has been a while since we introduced this whole idea, I want to dwell a little bit on why we think it important to set it up that way. Therefore, this is going to be what I'd like to call a half and half sermon. Not half good and half bad. Not half cream and not milk, I hope. But half context for the whole series and half specifically related to the first discipline of part 2. So, moving in that direction, what is the context of this whole sermon series and what is its connection to our church discernment process? Well, we're looking at all of these disciplines through 3 separate lenses. The first being how the church operates as subjects of the King, where we are welcomed into his presence by invitation. The second lens, as hosts, where we invite and welcome others into our circles of influence, bringing Christ's presence with us. And third, as we bring Christ's presence out into the larger culture, where we are not in control, and where we acknowledge Christ's presence, both in the world and in our own lives, but most often and usually by invitation. I've been a lifelong baseball fan. I played it, now I watch it, because I don't play it anymore. I wish I could. Now, there was a time when baseball teams were like civic institutions. They were locally owned, and they were kind of intertwined with their neighborhoods. And they were representative of their communities. All this changed when they became billion-dollar businesses, maximizing profit, the huge ego trips of their owners, paying their players more than any player could probably spend in a lifetime. And now Major League Baseball is once again enveloped in a labor dispute that may, in fact, interrupt the whole new season coming forward. I wonder if there might be a lesson there for the way we perceive and do church. This idea that church can be divorced from a localized community and become more of a destination attraction. It's kind of been prevalent in the evangelical church for a long time. But recent events, both political and social, inside and outside of the church, have forced us to reevaluate this way of looking at how we do church. Declining enrollments have been going on for quite some time, with several generations now claiming less and less interest in attending church, or for that matter, naming a particular faith position. Demographers call it the growing sector of the nuns. When I say that, I don't mean female persons of a particular religious order wearing black and white uniforms. By the way, what do you call black, white, black, white, black, white, black, white? That's a nun falling downstairs. Dad joke. No, what I mean actually by nuns is when they're filling out a form where it says religious affiliation equals none. So I've got nuns in my own family. Do any of you? Maybe there's someone listening right now, here or online, that identifies as a nun. But interestingly enough, at the same time that these expressions of non-affiliation are being made, we also find that people are protesting their feelings of their feelings of social isolation and loss of community. They're upset about that. They feel that loss. Well, enter the local community church, perhaps. Small, relationship-based, and focused on communal neighborhood engagement. Even large megachurches are now thinking in terms of decentralization with a focus on connection with its immediate surroundings, as opposed to an emphasis to kind of attractional brand development. I believe this is a good thing, because there is a legitimate concern when the mission of the church turns from pursuing the mission of God among its communities to building and preserving its own brand as an end in itself. Now, hear me, to be clear, I have no issue with churches finding and articulating their own spiritual values and calling. What I am concerned with is the motivation to do so. The why. Question is, do we create and articulate our image so that we can attract people to us? Or is it actually an exercise in self-understanding which will enable and compel its adherents to move out from the walls and into the communities where the lost and the suffering and the disenfranchised live? They aren't here. We're people of faith. We're saved. The lost aren't here. After all, Christ's direction to his church was not to sit and wait and entertain ourselves, but to go and bring. Literally, he said, go and make disciples. But you can't make a disciple unless you're in relationship with them. I'm reminded of what it says in Matthew 9, that someone had to literally pick up and carry the paralyzed man to Jesus so that he could be healed. So what we're trying to do with this sermon series, coupled with its discernment process, is seek God's direction about what kind of church he wants Queensway Baptist to be within the context of a missional church. Because there is no other context for the church. That's it. Jesus has not given us other options, even if we would like to think so. So what that means is that this place and everything about it needs to be a place where the followers are informed and strengthened and equipped to go out into the world and help others experience the presence of Jesus. It's like that droplet of living water dripping down into our midst and forming concentric circles of grace that flow out from Christ's energy, wave after wave after wave. So we've looked at these 7 disciplines as they relate to us here at Queensway Baptist Church, as subjects of the King in our close circle. We looked at the discipline of the Lord's table, the discipline of reconciliation, the discipline of gospel proclamation among us, ministering to the least of these, the discipline of ministering to children, the ministry of spiritual gifting, particularly as it pertains to our leadership, and the ministry of kingdom prayer. We focused on all of that as it relates to us. I want you to look at these verses, found in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 21 to 23. Far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, and above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the ages to come. This is God. And he, God, put all things under his feet. This is Jesus, under Jesus' feet, and gave him as head over all things to the church. And here we are, which is his body, the fullness of him who fills all in all. He fills us. His presence is here. So the key thing about any and all of these disciplines that we keep talking about can be summed up in 2 words: Christ's presence. So here is one of my main takeaways this morning. Wherever these 7 disciplines are, wherever these 7 disciplines are faithfully practiced, the presence of God will be active and evident. Wherever we go, as a church, as an individual follower of the Lord, we take his presence with us. So, that's what our sermon series is all about, essentially. And that's why we're discerning on Wednesday. How does all that apply to us here at Queensway? As we live together, as we live in our homes and with our close neighbors, and as we move out into the world. Which brings me to the second half of this morning's half and half. I want to talk to you about the discipline of ministering at the table as hosts. And I ask the question, who's invited? So apparently Jesus loved to eat. And I'm especially pleased about that. I'd probably follow him just for that, if for no other reason. Perhaps mealtime was a big deal for Jesus because it was a chance to deepen friendships and welcome strangers and serve the poor. It was, I'm sure, about a lot of other things, but at least it was about those three things. So could our everyday meal times do the same thing? Is that possible? Now, I do get that it was very much a cultural thing. Almost all ancient civilizations marked the significant days, their significant days, as feast days. And of course, the Israelites were no exception. Leviticus 23 briefly covers the feasts of what they call the Feasts of the Lord. There are 3 annual feasts that the Lord commanded all of Israel to celebrate in Jerusalem. 1, Passover. 2, Shavuot, the Pentecost. And 3, the Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles. Each feast, regardless of when or how it is celebrated, is referenced in the same way. The specific meaning of the way it is described in the ancient languages. And here it is, a holy convocation, a way of coming together that is holy. Holy being defined as God is present. So what are meal times like for your family? Have they changed much? In my past, when it came to celebrating holidays, for example, gathering for the extended family meal was always a pretty big deal. And some things haven't changed. Eating is still a huge part of celebration in ours as well as most cultures. Well, it's true for us to some extent. For example, we're about to experience the Super Bowl phenomenon next Sunday, which is often marked as a time for friends and family to get together and eat and eat and eat. And sometimes, I'm afraid, they do more than eat too much. I'm afraid. And of course, we have our traditional family feast days, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter. So a particular memory for me related to past Easter celebrations relates to an annual Easter missionary conference that was held at Bethel Chapel on Darling Street, right here in Brantford. They would always have like this huge banquet after their missionary conference. And the youth of the church were required and seconded to serve at that banquet. And I was one of the youth, and Carol was one of the youth too. It sticks in my memory. It's just lodged there. The Sunday dinner in my childhood also served as a special time when I was growing up. I guess what I remember most is that it was beef day. If I close my eyes, I can see the plate and I can still smell the smells. And good. And did you know that there are all kinds of particular food days? At least in the United States there are. In the U.S., there's Peanut Butter Lovers Day on March the 1st. There's National Banana Cream Pie Day on March the 2nd. Oh, yeah. There's National Chicken Soup Day on March 13, as well as a National Cereal Day on March 17. Who knew? And one of the best food-related events during the year is not a day, but a month. October is the American National Eat Better, Eat Together month. It's kind of fun to research for a sermon. But that's kind of a statement in itself, isn't it? There has to be something that encourages us to come together to eat. Kind of seems like a bit of a commentary on our culture and our society, doesn't it? I kind of think that this association of coming together to eat brings us closer to Jesus' view of coming together to eat at mealtimes. In the Bible, we often see Jesus stopping to eat with others. Eating together was a big deal for Jesus because it was a chance to, I'm going to bring these up one by one, to one. It was a chance to, one, deepen relationships, two, welcome strangers, and three, serve the poor. So I ask, could our everyday, ordinary mealtimes do the same thing? Eating together helps to deepen relationships. Shortly before he was arrested, Jesus invited his disciples to share a meal with him. It was Passover. Jesus wanted to invest deeply in his closest friends, reminding them of his love and equipping them for what lay ahead. It is the significance of that act that we celebrate this morning. We've already talked about its importance to our gathering as subjects in the close circle. We've had that discussion. But I'm suggesting to you that we must not forget that this precious memorial to our Lord came out of the simple act of a group of followers sharing a meal together. I'm also reminded of how Jonathan tells David in 1 Samuel 20 how he will be missed at the table where their friendship was cultivated. But David must flee the wrath of Saul, Jonathan's own father. It's amazing how friendships deepen over a meal. Just inviting friends to dinner can create a space for honest conversation, encouragement, and the chance to pray together. It's the go-to thing for me. I love to have lunch with folks, to get to know them, to hear their story, and to invite Jesus into the conversation. I love doing that. And this coming Friday, I'm having breakfast with a guy named Joe. I'll tell you about that in a few minutes, if I remember. In our own homes, do we use precious meal times to focus on those sitting with us? Are we actively listening and engaging? Are we risking ourselves in the moment? Are we opening ourselves to give and to receive? And hear me. When I say we, I definitely mean me, because these questions absolutely are convicting questions for me. But they're good questions, and I leave you with them. And now I ask, or at least I state, eating together helps us welcome strangers. Jesus talked a lot about ministering to those who were different. Not the same faith, not the same nationality, not even the same color. In the gospel accounts, by example, he modeled eating with those who were strange and just not like us, and those with whom we may not agree. It seemed that building relationship with those who are different often involved some kind of meal, some kind of gathering, some kind of social context. And I just love, I love what we find in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, where you have his disciples, grief-stricken and depressed, having returned to their former occupation after his death on the cross. And there they were, back at the lake, back becoming fishermen. And they were greeted from the beach by someone that they didn't even recognize, a perfect stranger. And what does he do? He invites them to breakfast. He invites them to share a meal with him. And by virtue of that invitation, Peter first, then all of them, they recognize their master, return from the dead, bringing life everlasting and living hope for all humanity. Hey, do you want to join me for breakfast? How cool is that? Lots of people say hello. And some go a step further and invite folks to lunch, for example. Do you? Do I? It's such an inclusive thing to do. Suddenly, perfect strangers can feel more like family. Maybe there could even be a perfect stranger living in your own family, sitting with you around your own table. How does that work? Well, maybe you just don't get each other anymore. Maybe you haven't for a long time. So meals are silent. They're silent times with not much going on in the way of relationship building. Family devotionals at mealtime used to be a thing. Is that happening very much now? Maybe the table is a place that could change because Jesus can be present around the table as well as around this communion table. By its very definition, being in communion means to be in relationship. It means to be joined. Our family tables could be the place where huge helpings of reconciliation, grace, and healing are dished out. And that brings me to my last point this morning. Eating together helps us serve the poor. Now, the next time we examine this particular topic, we will be looking at it in the context of ministering out there in a fallen and broken world where the poor and the disenfranchised reside. In the context of our own tables, however, or sharing around our own tables, I want to consider the poor from another perspective. I want us to think of those whom Jesus called poor in spirit. Those who could potentially find peace in his presence because, remember, it's all about his presence. The poor in spirit are those who cast themselves on God's grace, personally acknowledging their spiritual bankruptcy before God. One is reminded of the tax collector in the temple, beating his breast and saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Luke 18. It's an honest confession that it's the opposite of arrogance. In its deepest form, it acknowledges our desperate need for God. Jesus is declaring that the recognition of that need is the first step in finding resolution, reconciliation, and peace. I know about a program called Celebrate Recovery. I know about it well. And in Celebrate Recovery, the first three principles for moving forward toward healing is based on this very realization that I'm talking about. So the first three principles of Celebrate Recovery, I'm going to read to you. Principle 1, I realize that I am not God. I admit that I am powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong thing, and that my life has become unmanageable. Number 2, I earnestly believe that God exists, that I matter to him, and that he has the power to help me recover. And 3, I consciously choose to commit all my life and my will to Christ's care and control. In Celebrate Recovery, we name a higher power. That's Jesus. Interestingly enough, the principle of eating together after a Celebrate Recovery meeting is built right into the program. Folks are also encouraged to meet for coffee or a meal in order to support one another. That brings me back to Joe. Joe was my sponsor at Celebrate Recovery years ago. Joe is a multimillionaire who is a recovering alcoholic. And Joe loves Jesus, absolutely loves Jesus. And our sponsorship relationship has morphed into a deep, deep friendship that will be lifelong, that we maintain to this day. And as often as our schedules permit, we get together for breakfast. We get together to have a meal. Joe is turning 90 this year, and just last week he published his third book on a pet program of his, an interest of his, the successful Christian in the workplace. As a matter of fact, he has a whole foundation that he supports dedicated to education around that topic. I get to have a meal and sit and talk with a guy like that on a continuous basis. We get to support each other and love each other and care for each other. It's an amazing time. Can that happen in our homes as well? Who knows somebody who could benefit from a time of fellowship around your kitchen table where Jesus can be present and speak into difficult circumstances, or around a table in a restaurant? Yeah, and I understand that we have some restrictions right now because of COVID, but they won't always be with us. And we don't have a corner on the market of difficult and frightening circumstances, believe me. It is hard to imagine a more frightening time than that which existed at the birth of the church. We heard it read this morning, and we'll read again just briefly from Acts chapter 2, verse 42 to verse 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayer. And everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. And all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to one another as they had need. And every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Whoa. And all of that was happening while the Christians were being hunted down and used as human torches to light dark alleys and roadways in Jerusalem. Our homes are our refuge. I get that. But in a few moments, we're all going to meet around the Lord's table where he is host. Here, his presence becomes real by the power of his Holy Spirit. We partake together and seek to renew the discipline of being present to Christ, even as he is present to us. The Lord's table doesn't stop there. It extends into our homes and into our neighborhoods. As the early church father, John Chrysostom, said, there is liturgy after liturgy. Around the tables of our homes and neighborhoods, we gather to eat regularly. This can be where our neighbors and our friends can be welcomed and Christ's presence experienced. This place where we are hosts represents this second space for the table by virtue of our commitment to bring Jesus' presence with us. By our commitment to bring Jesus' presence with us. And how does that happen, you may ask? And that was read this morning as well. So just listen to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, 2 verses, 2 and 3. You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on the tablets of human hearts. We bring the presence of God with us. We sang this morning. We invited people to come to the table, family as well as strangers, seekers, those yet to make a commitment are welcome. They may not experience Christ present exactly the same way we do. Scripture makes that clear. But it can certainly become the beginning of that conversation. So, who's coming to dinner? Who's invited?